Hello and welcome to another Cliff Reviews Art House. This time I'm reviewing the documentary Amy, directed by Asif Kapadia, and the film Back to Black, directed by Sam Taylor Johnson. I've been meaning to watch the Amy documentary since it came out back in 2015, so I decided to make it a double bill with the Back to Black movie. I started out with the Amy documentary. I thought I'd watch the factual biography first before the dramatised one. So I had seen the Senna documentary, which was directed by Asif Kapadia. It's a while ago that I saw it, but I do remember enjoying it. I thought that this Amy documentary was fantastic. This is definitely a story worth documenting. Amy Winehouse was an incredible talent, a unique personality, with complex emotional and mental issues. She died at age 27 from alcohol poisoning. And it's a really sad story as she was so talented but so troubled at the same time. And unfortunately, her problems in life bled into her performances multiple times, appearing drunk on stage, sometimes being unable to perform. The documentary does a really good job of presenting a lot of original video and audio footage, as well as photos. And as much as it can, it lets this original material speak for itself. There's no narration. To the extent that it includes retrospective interviews, it hardly uses the talking head format. Rather, it uses the audio of such interviews with original footage or photos. The documentary includes all of the complexities of her life, including her parents separating, a relationship with Blake Fielder, and her addiction to alcohol and drugs. The film doesn't make any explicit judgments, I think, but the material doesn't present many of the people around Amy in a good light at all. She was clearly a very vulnerable person, and ultimately she wasn't given the protection that she needed. This is the impression that the documentary gives, particularly in relation to her dad, Mitch Winehouse, and her husband, Blake Fielder. We're left with the impression that they both had quite a negative impact on her. However, I do think we have to be careful here. By focusing mainly on original material, nothing is really put into context, so I don't think it can necessarily be completely trusted, even though it appears like a reliable source because it's original material. Certainly both Mitch Winehouse and Blake Fielder have publicly criticised the documentary for unfairly representing them. Overall, my opinion on this issue is that if you watch the documentary in an intelligent way, aware that we might not fully understand the context of a particular clip, this is an authentic account of her story. But if someone watches this and just believes everything as it's presented, I do think it could be problematic. What really does stand out in the documentary is the brutal nature of the paparazzi. Multiple times we see Amy in a vulnerable state, swarmed upon by these photographers, really aggressive. These clips are edited in a way to portray the violence of these situations. It's really horrific, and it's a really sad indictment on how we treat celebrities in the press and media. The documentary also uses her music in a really effective manner. We hear a lot of her music during the film, and it's accompanied by the lyrics on the screen. And very often this links directly with the time of her life that's being portrayed on the screen at the same time. She created really original pop songs, and she had a totally unique style. And I do think that the documentary really celebrates this. So while the chaos of her life develops in the film, her amazing music provides a thread of something much more optimistic. I thought that this balance between the sadness and the genius made for an excellent documentary of her life and her music. What I really loved was how the film showed that she was first and foremost a really talented musician, poet, artist. And although the tortured artist is such a cliche, we're really left with the sense that she had to make this work just to survive. This rawness, this authenticity is perhaps one of the reasons why her music was just so popular. There is one moment in the documentary that really touched me. It was the moment that she was presented with a Grammy, but she was in London at the Riverside Studios. and Tony Bennett and Natalie Cole were on the screen announcing the nominees, she looked at the screen with these wide open eyes of awe and joy. We already knew that Tony Bennett is one of her idols, and it's a wonderful moment of her realising that she's effectively on the same stage as he is. For me, this isn't just a moment of her looking up to him, it's her realising that she's his equal. Great art connects people in this way. Later we see them singing together, and it's not always a comfortable experience, as clearly Amy isn't that well, but Tony seems understanding, and together they do successfully make a recording. For me, this turns out to be a really beautiful moment. Overall, this is a fantastic documentary, really well made, really interesting subject, very sad and very moving. I highly recommend it. So after watching Amy, I then watched Back to Black. Now I think I made a mistake here because I immediately started watching Back to Black when I'd finished Amy. I don't think this was fair to the dramatised version of her life. The documentary is so raw and authentic, so sad and so emotional. I really struggled watching a dramatisation of it. I'm not saying this is fair, but it really felt disrespectful. The dramatisation seemed just too trivial compared to the real experience of the material in the documentary. I totally recognise that Back to Black may have been a completely different experience watching it this year, 9 years after the documentary was released. That said, I would argue that it's not totally unreasonable to judge these films directly against each other. But I guess it would be interesting what reaction I would have had if I'd seen them the other way round. I know that there were a number of critics that didn't like Marisa Abela's portrayal of Amy. I actually didn't find this a problem. She's an excellent actor, and I thought she did an amazing job at playing Amy. After having seen all the original footage, of course, she never really became Amy for me. But I think it was close enough that had I had a gap between the two films, the portrayal of Amy was authentic enough in Back to Black. Of course, she's not quite got the voice of Amy Winehouse, but boy, she does do a great job of singing the songs. As the film developed, I started to have more problems with it than just the direct comparison with the original footage. The story it presents is a very different story than that presented in the documentary. Given what I said about the documentary, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Watching them both together, I can realise that I just can't know exactly what happened, and it's good to be made aware of different possibilities to what the out-of-context clips in the documentary may be suggesting. However, by the end of the film, I was pretty dissatisfied with it. It definitely doesn't have the authenticity or the rawness of the documentary. It feels like a much gentler, almost sanitised version of the story. The addiction is definitely mentioned, but we don't really see the depth of it in the way that we do in the documentary. Also, the portrayal of Amy's dad, Mitch, and Blake, her husband, are much more sympathetic than the way they're portrayed in the original footage. Who knows what the truth is, but this felt much less authentic than the documentary. The film primarily focuses on her relationship with Blake. In fact, if you had to categorise the film, you might even say it's a love story, a romance. The documentary clearly displays her very close, possibly codependent, possibly toxic, but possibly genuinely loving relationship with Blake. But I felt that the real focus of the documentary was her genius and the music, which shines through despite her problems and the complexities of her life. I had the feeling that Back to Black slightly downplayed the music. Rather, it emphasised Amy's desires in relation to the relationship. In the film, Amy's focus seems to be as much on marriage and having children as making her music. I'm sure that Sam Taylor-Johnson didn't mean to do this, but I was left wondering if the film focused too much on the stereotypical female obsessed by having babies with her man, rather than the genius possessed by this amazing woman, a woman who could genuinely stand in the company of Tony Bennett or Charlie Parker. For me, the most interesting story about Amy's life is that she created this incredible music, this incredible art, despite the complexities and difficulties of her life. Maybe even because of the complexities and difficulties. Maybe some people love the focus on the romance with Blake, and it certainly does prevent an alternative view to the documentary, which may be fair, given that the original clips aren't put into context. However, for me, the lack of focus on the amazing creativity, on the amazing music, this really devalued Back to Black. I was really disappointed that the film completely missed that moment when she first sees Tony Bennett and Natalie Cole on the screen at the Grammy Awards. Well, it didn't miss the moment, it did recreate it, but it missed for me what the most important thing was, that wonderful moment before the announcement when Amy stood in amazement seeing her idol Tony Bennett. It does recreate the moment, but just shows her waiting nervously for the announcement. This was really disappointing for me, as I think that this moment played a critical role in the documentary, capturing her realisation that she was at home amongst the best jazz musicians in the world. I can't tell you what my review of Back to Black would have been if I hadn't seen Amy first. My guess is that I wouldn't have felt as strongly about it, but if I had watched them the other way round, I do think that I would be comparing them in a pretty similar way. My final verdict is that I do highly recommend the documentary Amy. I don't really recommend the film Back to Black, though I do think it's an interesting, worthwhile experience to watch them both as a way of having different views and perspectives on Amy's life and career.